Thank you very much, Dr. Flick. Ladies and gentlemen, a number of times we've heard about the paradox relating to the highly topical question which this CONVOCO forum is dealing with today. How much freedom must we forgo to be free? Now, can you really gain freedom by foregoing freedom? Now, how this paradox can be resolved depends to a great extent as to what you understand by the term freedom and what dimension of freedom you're referring to. Let me give you a specific example. In the UK, for nearly 2 weeks ago, on the 19th of July, nearly all of the remaining corona restrictions were lifted despite the increase in infections, and the government called this the Freedom Day. And for many people, in formal terms, for everybody basically, this meant more freedom. For example, we don't have to wear masks anymore. You can get together in larger groups, for example. But this day was seen by others as nothing, certainly not as liberation, but more a threat. Those people who, for whatever reason, are at a specific or greater risk. Maybe they cannot be vaccinated. Freedom Day for them meant a loss of freedom because now they have to basically isolate themselves to protect themselves, and they have to restrict their daily lives. In order to increase their freedom, we would have to reestablish the corona restrictions. This is something that might happen this fall or might not. But I think this example alone shows us how we are determining this by individual and social factors, how this is all determined. And that is why our first panel discussion today will be dealing with individual and social dimensions of freedom. So just to break the ice, I'd like to show you a lot of our discussions that we've had over the last couple of years. There was a wide range of discussions, and this will be a type of common thread, these questions that were raised. And Dr. Flick mentioned some of them in her introductory speech. There are 5 points I'd like to raise. First of all, it became very clear to us that a certain amount of security is a prerequisite for any type of freedom. This is an old finding. It's nothing new. We can see it very clearly stated in the social contracts and Thomas Hobbes' consideration of these considerations. In Leviathan, he said that the natural state is of people having a war, fighting a war against everyone, fights all, and this can only be achieved by establishing a state. That means that people have to abandon some of their natural freedom, and also their right to self-defense is transferred to a strong sovereign. And in return, what they get is security so that they will not be threatened by others. Based on this finding, in other words, that safety, security as a prerequisite for our life and our life in freedom, this is something that set us back during the corona crisis. At the beginning, I assume, at the beginning of last year, I'm sure that you feel just like I do. At the beginning of last year, hardly anyone would expect to have to go through a lockdown, shutting down major parts of our economy, schools closing, lockdowns, etc. All of this was in the interest of maintaining our lives and keeping our healthcare system operational. The first point I'd like to mention is that there is no freedom without the safety that we need. But even before we think about state informations or also self-realization within the state, first of all, what we need is a state to protect us in order to guarantee a certain amount of order. The second point I have is, what is individual or social freedom? And I think we have to note that the nomenclature is sometimes a bit misleading. For example, it implies individual freedom can only be possible, or that we can have individual freedom outside of society, but freedom can only be thought in terms of our society. So if you consider yourself as Robinson Crusoe on an island, for him, freedom is insignificant. Individual and freedom is a question here. So if we think about the individual and social dimensions of freedom, then what we're referring to here is civil liberties within society, either referring basically to individuals' autonomy or participating in certain social processes. In English, we have two terms that are sometimes used. They're actually synonyms. When I say freedom, I'm focusing more on the individual aspects, and the term liberty refers more to the social context. In German, and if we take a look at our constitutional rights, then of course you can see very clearly that the individual aspect is in the foreground. When we talk about the freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, and then we also think about certain social processes, then we can talk about freedom of assembly or freedom of the press. Here we're talking about freedom and civil liberties that are able to develop their impact. Now, of course, you can shift the meaning slightly, and maybe you can take individual and social dimensions and delimit them somewhat differently. We can talk about negative and positive freedoms, which we've heard about already today. By negative freedom, what we mean is our defense position that an individual has vis-a-vis the state. Freedom from intervention, regulation, restriction. So to put it casually, freedom means you can do what you want and not do what you want. When we talk about positive freedom, this is a freedom to do something. In other words, freedom to have an impact on regulations which would affect one. Positive freedom means to be your own master. And in democracy, this is allowing you to be part of opinion forming and also participating in free and general elections. My third point, how are these all interrelated? One thing is clear. The existence of one type of freedom does not guarantee the existence of another type of freedom, at least not automatically. We have authoritarian, non-democratic states which guarantee a great amount of leeway and individual freedoms. But theoretically, you might also have a popular government which will prescribe very detailed restrictions, or they could also eliminate civil liberties of minorities. So we came to the conclusion that in the ideal world, negative and positive freedoms can be combined, and that we have to see that they interact, and that in the following way. If you assume that there is no absolute freedom for the individual in society, simply because we have to delimit the different areas of life for individuals, then of course we would have to restrict individual freedom. These restrictions of negative freedom are compatible with freedom if the person involved in this restriction process can also exert their positive freedom in other words, to be able to have an impact on the opinions that are formed. Then we not talking here about a restriction of a regulation. This is something that can even expand freedom. You can see this very clearly in the social contract of the French philosopher Rousseau, and you can also compare this to Hobbes' Leviathan. Rousseau says that with the social contract, individuals are abandoning or foregoing natural freedom in order to have freedom in society. So this, of course, means that you might have a dictatorship of the majority vis-a-vis a minority. That's why an inalienable core of negative freedom has to be guaranteed, which cannot be canceled by positive freedom. So in this way, we come to the conclusion that the total amount of freedom can be measured by two factors. On the one hand, how much individual leeway does an individual have to act? And on the other hand, how well and how reliably does the democratic rule of law function? And the fourth point in my introduction is the relationship between freedom and equality. This was mentioned beforehand as well. The relationship between freedom and equality is often seen as a tension. The more freedom we allow, the more unequal our society will become. The more equality we want and assert, the more restrictions to our freedom we will have to accept. But interestingly, freedom and equality have not always been seen as antagonists. And in the modern era with Enlightenment, this is the time when they became especially prominent, and they were seen as being complementary. Freedom and equality are complementary, and they were basically seen as twins. You can see this in the slogan of the French Revolution, where freedom and equality come before fraternity. And you can also see this in the construction of the social contract according to Rousseau. The contract, which is to allow for freedom, is something that has to be concluded, first of all. And the prerequisite for this contract is equality or equivalent of those concluding the contract, because this can only be concluded amongst equivalents. Only at the beginning of the 19th century do we see a shift in perception where we believe that freedom and equality need to be considered together. And if we do so today, some people do, then we have to ask, what is the logical starting point? What comes first? That's what we asked ourselves. If we talk about freedom as coming first and we restrict it where it is necessary, where equality requires this to be done, but then a newer approach in some parts of the world, we should say that we should start from equality and only guarantee freedom where there are good reasons to do so, as long as it does not damage equality. Is exercise of freedom something that needs to be legitimized, or is it risky if we define freedom, if it's not seen as something which is a requirement here, and also to make it universal? This is something that we normally assume, because then we're not thinking of it as a value in and of itself, but that this is then seen as an instrumental understanding, and that seems to be rather fragile and vulnerable. So we also asked if it might be possible to find a common denominator in order to reconcile the two. That we talk about material goods, and if we talk about that, but at the same time we can see equality as equal opportunities, and this is something that would have to be offered to all members of society. We offer them the same freedoms. Is this compatible then with an unequal distribution of goods, which would result? So the question is true equal opportunity something that can be achieved realistically, and what do we have to do for it if we do achieve it? My fifth and final point is something that I'd like to deal with very quickly, a number of current problems and trends which we see with respect to individual and social dimensions of freedom. I'd simply like to just mention them right now very briefly. Individual freedom and the exercise of this freedom. Well, we asked ourselves, based on the newer findings of neuroscience, which we've also heard about this afternoon as well, we asked ourselves, is there a free will? Is this possible, or is free will something that is just an illusion? If so, then not only do we have a philosophical and theoretical problem, we also have a legal problem, because the allocation of actions and responsibilities, for example, in the instance of a criminal conviction, this is taken by someone acting voluntarily, and a deterministic view of the world will call this into question. We're also making more and more progress when it comes to artificial intelligence. Is it conceivable that a highly complex self-learning machine will then develop an awareness and even claim individual freedom? This is a question that we were not able to answer our question in the forum. But we did deal with the question of what is referred to as nudging, especially with the idea that the state should and maybe can not prescribe individual decisions for well-meaning paternalism. This would then exclude freedom, but in certain areas they can give us or steer us in the correct direction by giving certain incentives or setting certain rules that you would have to opt out of if you don't like them. For example, organ donations. This is something that's discussed again and again. Maybe we can come up with a solution of dissent as opposed to the requirement to agree, which is the case today. And we have this possibility for dissent in some countries already. We also found that individual basic laws have changed over the course of time. And historically speaking, these civil rights were rights of defense. But often we have to consider the growth in entitlements vis-a-vis the state, because the best freedoms don't do us any good at all if we cannot exercise these freedoms. For example, if we don't have a home, we can enjoy these rights to privacy. That's why it's been noted for a long time now that in addition to certain rights of defense, we also have rights to entitlements and participation, especially when it comes to social minimum standards. But the claims placed on the state these days go much further. And this is associated with something that we've seen for about 15 years now, and this is an interventionist trend. We can see this today in our discussion as to whether the state should compensate flood victims for those who did not conclude an insurance agreement for this type of damage. Are we sending out the wrong message, or is it a good message to be sending out? We recently found that freedom and responsibility correlate. A contentious question was, should people who enjoy certain civil liberties, should they also have an obligation due to the correlation between freedom and responsibility? Should there be an obligation to make use of these rights? In some countries, there is an obligation to vote. It's mandatory. So this means that you're giving up a bit of freedom, because freedom also means that an individual is free not to take advantage of some of the freedoms he has. So that was basically a brief overview of today's discussions with regard to the background and introduction to our panel discussion. So now I'd like to ask the panelists and the moderator to come up on stage.